So the first thing is to thank you all. Thank you very, very much for being here this afternoon and for your contributions, wonderful contributions, and for participating in this digital prequel and this end roundtable. I'm just delighted to see you all, and some of you I've never met before, but we've been corresponding and it's been really wonderful. So thank you, really warm thank you. I've revisited the contributions in the last 2 days. I've revisited all of them, which has been wonderful. Incredibly moving, very provocative, but also really politically and intellectually stimulating. And what I thought was really interesting was thinking about the fact that this work was made before the killing of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter protests that followed around the world. And yet so many of these contributions were relevant and read now as particularly relevant, having witnessed those events. So I wondered if we might lead in with 3 sort of clusters of ideas that some of you sent through. And I wanted to begin with something Janelle raised, which is to start with the here and now and think about the archive and queering the archive in the context of the recent wave of statue removal as part of racial injustice protests taking place across the globe, and also of museums being, it being demanded that museums repatriate objects stolen from their original colonized locations. What might this mean to thinking about the archive? And to thinking about the archive, as Janelle put it, through a subtractive strategy. The archive is something that might be subtracted from, as well as added to. So how do these acts of removal both reanimate these memorials and objects and open up a space for forming a kind of new historical and archival imaginary? That was Janelle's question. And we might ponder this, she suggests, through Roma's concept of outscription, which several people were really taken with, which Roma you defined as the opposite of inscription, outscription, the opposite of laying a claim, the opposite of making your mark. Or we might think about the archive through Geordie's description of it as a kind of irritant, a grain of sand that got stuck. Or thinking of it the other way around from the subtractive strategy of taking things out or getting rid of things that have come to stand for something. We might think of it the other way around in terms of what's been omitted, what worlds cannot be imagined or encountered, which bodies make themselves intelligible to the world and which ones don't and can't, and which ones have to invent their own worlds to become imaginable. What gets left out of the educational archive of the history of so-called Western civilization and progress, as Julieta narrates through her dialogue with her young daughter. Topher writes that in Fetish, he wanted to stun the viewer, to force a reaction, so that the Black queer body can be seen as it is, unguarded, vulnerable, and powerful. But as he says, like the man who fell to earth, he has to exist in another dimension. To use time and space travel to imagine himself. Like Mojisola's character of the old lady who goes into space in search of an orgasm, inspired by 3 encounters. It's necessary to travel somewhere else to find what she wants. So finally then, maybe the idea of queering the archive involves some kind of encounter. The archive doesn't exist perhaps until we encounter it, select things, see and feel the absences and presences. The archive is always partial. For example, the encounter with Harry Crawford's photograph, An Imagined Life in Alison's work, or the one we hear about in Stars with Maxie, which sends the old lady into space. Or Claire's invented love letters that she longed to find but never did in the Emma Goldman archive. Or in Dell's presentation, where we hear about the erotic and unpredictable encounters of making portraits that now form their archive, the images in their archive, which were presented in their contribution. Or to think of what Geordie and Honor discussed, where Geordie talks about the archive as a contingent encounter, as the moment that there's an eruption of the past into the present. And he says we might try and figure out what is the relationship between dispossession and chance. Or as Monica says in her interview with me, you only start remembering things when you're asked. So perhaps we might finish by thinking about how the archive is always a collaborative project. It's always about encounters and conversations.
Yeah, I was very worried about not remembering things. And I felt a great responsibility in doing this interview. I felt like it was a really important project and that I had one chance to give my account of what it was like being in ACT UP over several years, you know, and several life events happened. And I felt very much the responsibility of that. And I couldn't decide how much I should go do, you know, a personal research, how much I should look at old writings of mine, maybe date books I had or journals that I kept. I couldn't decide whether to read other interviews that were already available to see if I didn't want to be constrained by what I read, but I also didn't want to be left flailing for facts or information. So I did a little bit. I dipped into some of the other interviews. I did go back to some stuff of mine that I had my personal archives of. And amazingly, I think other people who have been interviewed for anything might be able to testify to this. You start remembering things when you're being asked. It's really extraordinary.
Yeah, yeah.
And this is, you know, I'm so interested in what Janelle proposed as a way of thinking through the archive of things that are taken away and how that is creating history and creating an archive in the same way. But I'm also really taken with, you know, Topher introducing himself, saying that he makes mistakes. But also I'm thinking about accidents and accidental archives and the ways that we have, say, footage of something or a record of something, not because a statue was erected or a memorial was made, or something was memorialized, but because someone happened to be somewhere with a camera. I was thinking about how in ACT UP, we initially had, you know, the late 80s was the sort of inauguration of affordable handheld cameras, and affordable only for very few people still, but nevertheless, they became available. And a lot of the footage we were taking was a way of making sure that the police didn't have the only narrative of what they were doing to us. We were recording our actions and sometimes just recording their badge numbers and their faces when they covered their badges as a way of having our own record of what was happening to us. And of course, increasingly, we started to make footage of the events for ourselves, and partly because certainly the mainstream press wasn't covering us as much as we needed them to and wanted them to. So all of that record and footage is really accidental, right? There wasn't it certainly wasn't an intention. So that's just one thing I thought of, Jackie, when you were introducing those ideas. And I really love Topher saying, as a way of describing himself, that he makes mistakes. I think I'm going to start saying that too.
Something I was thinking about in terms of this idea of subtraction or a subtractive model is because when I think of archive, I think of forming a collection. And so much about queer archive is about bringing things, making things visible, bringing things into visibility that aren't there. And I was just thinking, like these statues being taken down, some of them, particularly the ones in Britain, because I'm originally from the US, I didn't even know who these people were until the statues come down. So there was like a sense that in their physical removal, it brought a kind of visibility to them, but in a way that had sort of this temporal relation, right, from where we are now rather than from where we were when the statue was erected. So I was just thinking about how the effective registers of that kind of removal and how that creates a different kind of temporal dynamic or a different kind of archiving or historical record. And it also kind of made me think about, you know, if we think about these statues as kind of like boulders in the way of our path, and we're trying to go through these paths, and you remove the boulder, and its imprint is still there. It's not gone from our consciousness, but it sort of opens up paths to move past it or move around it or move in a different way, I guess, is sort of what I was thinking about.
Thinking about this discussion in relation to, I think somebody raised the idea of accidental archives, and it was making me think about an event I went to a few years ago with, I think Sonia Boyce did a kind of takeover of the Manchester Art Gallery, and she staged one of the paintings being taken down. I think it was sort of bringing about a kind of conversation about around kind of issues to do with Me Too, and also the kind of exclusions, who isn't included in Manchester Art Gallery's archive in particular, but also, or their kind of collections, but also other kinds of institutions more generally. And what was particularly fascinating about that, the sort of staging of the you know, it was a huge event with lots of people present watching this painting being kind of almost sort of ceremonially taken down and put into storage. What I found so fascinating about that was that this is actually something that happens all the time in museums and galleries. And so there's something about how certain erasures, certain statues are coming down all around us, to like think of statues maybe more figuratively. And so I'm wondering, like, what other kinds of exclusions that mean that the archives that we produce have these kind of well, we're not even understanding the accidental nature of them.
I think I mean, I think the thing around subtraction and space is a contested thing for me. I mean, I'm just looking at the framing. I'm a filmmaker, so I'm looking at the way things move. But if I do that, you've got a lot of space above my head, and you've got, you know, what you might see the absence of a person, but it's obviously it's the presence of something else, and like a lot of the things that is the queer black space, or if there isn't a queer black space, but is the other space, or the space that there is not about what is absent, but about shedding, if you like, light, for want of a better word, on what actually is. So it's not a subtraction. So taking statues down, describing yourself as messy and living life is actually the way it is. The idea of a linear or even a tangential narrative that kind of encapsulates us is a myth. We are moving through time and space constantly. So the idea of bringing, as Moj does with her work, time and space into the work is not about taking it elsewhere. It's about saying where we are. And the other thing is also to talk about a subtraction is to talk about, and I love what you were talking about, Dale, in terms of the erotic gaze, or the gaze as an erection, is talking about where the gaze, as in GAZE, emerges from. And what I'm trying to do is open up space-time to show you that actually your gaze is just really kind of a modicum of what actually is. And if you look at, there's a kind of a movement called dark matter, which is kind of references the idea of fiction or mythical fiction or speculative fiction from black and sometimes black queer perspectives. In people call it sci-fi otherwise, but you know, the universe is something like 95% dark matter. The idea that you have to look the idea of seeing differently is very much embedded in my work, and as in Dale's and in Moji's and the people I actually know. We are at the center of the universe, but if we were 25 billion light years away, we'd also be at the center of the universe. You know, that is actually just the way it is. It's not necessarily, and also the third thing is that just because human logic doesn't understand it, it doesn't have to fit what human logic understands. So when we go back to things like Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, black is and black ain't. Several things can exist at the same time and be equally as.
Before the hankering, the hawking, the hawkeye, the hanky code, the polarized, the polari, the polar axis, polar bears, the other bears, the boars, the borders, the borers, the aurora borealis, the daughters of Bilitis, before you mistreaters, before your mother was a fetus, before the dreamless, deedless, daedalus, the daddyless. I think of you as knowing before I think of you, knowing as I do think of you. I do prescribe you from use of us in all the ways that history dispossesses us before the hankering, the aurora borealis. Think of you as knowing the hawking, the hawkeye, the daughters of Bilitis before I think of you, the hanky code, before you mistreat us, knowing as I do the polarized, the polari before your mother was think of you. I do prescribe the polar actors, polar bears, the fetus, before you from use of us in all the other bears, the boars, the dreamless, deedless, the ways that history, the borders, the borers, daedalus, the daddyless, I dispossesses us.
I think one of the things I was thinking about in relation to outscription was that same dynamic of like what is and what isn't, because a lot of the conflict within my writing was about those inscriptions and the fact that I paid much more attention to the inscription of the book that detailed a place that I knew very well, which was like a road 2 roads away from where I grew up as a child, just as who would own that book had written their name and address in it. And I didn't finish reading the book because I was so preoccupied with like seeing that place and that name that I knew, and also a place I hadn't returned to. For at least 3 years, I haven't been back to Reading. I was like, I want to write about this place. I want to write about my time in this place, but I can't return to this place. And how do I do that? Is that fair to do that from just this inscription? And therefore that book kind of, it did hold a power that it didn't particularly want to, or like I put some power in it that wasn't there except for a meaning that I had from it. And I think that ties into a lot of these questions around these statues and the meanings that they hold when we don't maybe pay attention to all of the meanings that are held in inscriptions of people, just even if it's just a name and a place, like all of that can hold meaning as well.
Someone got in touch with me recently, a researcher, really cool person. Everything's cool with them and their project, so this is no criticism of that, but they mentioned that there may well be a statue created of Alan Croft, and as they'll remember, so Alan Croft was a mid-19th century enslaved African-American woman who cross-dressed as a white man to escape slavery. And she was very much the inspiration for the collaboration that Dale mentioned earlier, Moji of the Antarctic. So we took this story inspired by Ellen Croft and extended the story to Antarctica. And yes, so this person got in touch, said there's a possibility of this statue being erected of Ellen Croft because Ellen Croft came to live with her husband in London. They had 4 children, met Queen Victoria, and were abolitionists themselves, and they're amazing, amazing people. And Ellen Croft's side of that story, because William Croft, her husband, wrote a book about their escape, but you don't really hear Ellen Croft's voice in that book. So it's kind of focusing on her and her transvestism for freedom. I don't know, I'm really torn about it. I'd be really interested to hear what other people might think about it, because somehow the thought of this idea of making a statue, not that I object to it or anything like that, but somehow working within that same kind of trope, that same kind of practice of putting a body in stone or brass and putting it on a plinth. What I'm really excited about is the kind of uncovering or extraction, if you like, or outscribing, was it? Outscripting? So, you know, when Topher walks naked through the streets of New York, or in the stripping away in Dell's work, and so many works to talk about, but, you know, focusing right in on a clitoris that is considered too large, you know. I think I'm much more interested in that kind of, you know, this stripping away, rather than the trying to kind of present ourselves within the kind of mold that has already been placed somehow. And also, I suppose, because of that we'll never ever have enough statues if we try and play that game, you know, if we try and do the statues thing, we'll just always kind of somehow indicate that there are, or somehow reinforce the idea that there's so few of us around, you know, that we've just got this one statue. I don't know, but I'd be curious to know what other people think about that.
I've been thinking a lot about that, about representation and responsibility, along with what really came up for me with reading your piece, Topher, was the links between the ways, and also with Ellen Craft, the way the abolitionist exploited her sexy, strange story of cross-dressing as not really to benefit her, but to benefit them, the white abolitionist. That's my reading of it anyway. And, you know, what is the link between self-objectification and commodification? You know, are those always the prices that we have to pay to have a seat at a table, to get any kind of space for ourselves in this time? And how, like, I have this picture here of an intersex body from the 18th or maybe 19th century. I'm always getting centuries wrong. And the same person again, but there was an explosion of intersex people, hermaphrodites, coming forward to exploit themselves, to be objects for the medical profession, for the clinicians of the time, who would often have their genitals as the main subject and hide their heads in their faces in shame. And yet this was a way of surviving. This was a way of making money, as was the bearded lady and the fat person and the Siamese twins in the freak shows. So how much do we have to freakify ourselves to be able to have a voice? And also what you had said about, you know, how much do we use the status quo? Like you talk about the way in which you have your really fit, you know, masculine body, and the way in which as a young person, especially, you felt objectified by white gay men. But now it seems in fetish, you're using the status quo against itself as a comment. So these are all the kind of thoughts that come up for me from what you were just saying, Maj, and what I've been thinking about a lot.
fetish doesn't really exist, if you know what I mean. It's a figure that doesn't exist, and that's the point of putting it in the space, because you can't get past it unless you see it. So, or at least unless you see that form, you can't really get past it. So in the same way that you see a group of black boys, teenage boys, young boys, on a street corner in Berlin, in Los Angeles, in London, in New York, and they don't really exist. They don't exist. They're just things to either move out of the way or dismiss. But I wanted fetish to show you that they did exist, but in a very different way to the way you'd understand. So you have to look and look again. So because as a black male and cisgendered, and that's kind of what I've always been, the idea of what, as I, in the time and space I've existed in the late 20th century, now in the early 21st century, the time I've existed in, the only times where I've really existed is when I've been talking to other people who are black in the defined way. Outside of that space, I haven't really existed, because there's always been a question: who are you? What are you doing here? Why are you here? Where have you come from? What do you do? How did you do it? Why are you doing it? It's just this constant, this constant bewilderment that the world has with black masculinity. So that's the space that fetish exists in. And then in terms of the, if you like, quite deliberately, with archive, the same way with archive, or the same with the framing of a photograph, you are deliberately placing the word fetish within the vernacular of its understanding, historically, colloquially, and perhaps even medically, I don't know. But so you're sort of saying, this is the frame that exists, that you understand. So I knew that when I was younger, that when I was defining myself as gay, the whole idea of what that meant was really much about a sexualized body, male body, about presenting a sexualized male body and availability. But within that, there was a very narrow kind of space that body could exist as well.
I'm more willing to push myself and to take risk with myself than I am for others, because a lot of what motivated me to become a photographer, I was a theater photographer. I was taking shots for actors, headshots. I got very good at being able to connect quickly with people and to have them connect with me. But it was also about making people look good.
Yeah.
And to see themselves as they wanted to be seen. And God knows I've been photographed by other people enough, especially photojournalists, who seem to have this idea that I should be depicted as a monster. And I can be very depressed looking at other people's photographs of me. So I had to take control of the means of production, you see. This picture here on the left of me, I probably never showed because I thought it was ugly. I thought I was too fat. I had a lot of internalized, I grew up around beautiful women. I wanted to be a beautiful woman, and then my body betrayed me, and I grew a beard, and only half of my body developed as female, and I thought I was a monster. So I'm doing work with InterMe, this 10-year self-portraiture project, to explore that and to see how, as Joe Spence was using photography as therapy, I also was doing that, but as a way of being able to cope with, I guess, my disappointment at not being beautiful. Although the pictures tell a different story. And when I say things, I think, Siobhan, you've said that too, you weren't ugly, you weren't, and it's an important part of my story to know that in my teenage years, because of the way my body developed in unusual ways, I did feel like a monster. I know not all of us are on Facebook or even use social media, but for those of us who do, it's like I have as much, if not more, affinity and feeling for my 3-year-old self as my 14-year-old self, as my 62-year-old self. All of these moments for me exist simultaneously, even though I'm in this corporeal form now.
Yeah, but Del, your
photographs that have attempted to have all of these moments and genders and bodies together.
But your photographs, Del, more than, and that this came up in our discussion, are more interactive than, you know, a photograph might look static or statuary, but your photographs are so interactive. I mean, they really are the kind of result of intense desire happening and communication happening, and it's really remarkable to think of it that way.
Thanks.
Thank you.
But I mean, it's also this thing. Maybe you didn't get it, Topher, and so much. But the way in which traditionally people who are different, be it people with disabilities, people of color, like you mentioned, Sartre, Bartman in your essay, in your piece, and how she was exploited and fetishized and displayed, and how this is how many people, and I argue that I do it myself. I do it constantly. I'm different, and that difference has a value. It is a commodity, you know. And how do I feel about that? That connects back to what you were saying, Mojisola, of like, how do I feel? I mean, you're talking about, in a way, the commodification of Ellen Craft, and looking and using, like, basically the master's tools to try to dismantle the master's house. Is that what you were saying, Moj? Where are you? Is that a quick way of saying it, that you're questioning that way, as Audre Lorde has questioned it for so long? I'm not sure, you know, tabloid TV, is it really a man or really a woman? How do we work with these different strategies to subvert them?
I'll never forget the way you looked at me then, your head slightly tilted to one side, your eyes wide in bewilderment. We were sitting on the landing floor at the top of the apartment stairs, the contents of your backpack scattered all around us. This is not what my teacher told us, you said with unmistakable agitation. I knew that for the first time you were confronting the existence of conflicting worldviews, a vital gulf between your formal education and your maternal one. That's okay, I said. My job as your mother is to tell you these stories differently and to tell you other stories that don't get told at school. I pressed on to explain that history is a story based on a version of the past. Can you hear the word story in history? I asked you. You nodded slowly, a little body deep in rumination. These stories need to be told from the perspective of those who have been most damaged by history. These other stories, I said, can teach us how to keep living.
Hi, my name is Jordy Rosenberg, and I'm speaking to you from a corner of my pantry. I'm going to read a very short selection from this book, Confessions of the Fox, that I wrote. I'm going to read just a couple paragraphs from the very end. These two lovers, the main characters, Jack and Bess, have just been reunited. Jack has been executed for prison breaking and very minor property crimes, and he's been miraculously brought back to life. They are escaping London, where the thief catchers are after them, and they're fantasizing about moving to the fenlands of England, where they will start a revolutionary guerrilla kind of army or join one that already exists. They're not sure if it still exists. They're called the Fen Tigers. And they also are in possession of a kind of people's science, a recipe for producing testosterone, exogenous testosterone supplementation. This is made out of like pig urine and parsley root, and a lot of rituals conducted under a certain amount of cloud cover when the constellations are in certain alignments. And so they're in this horse cart traveling out of London, sort of dreaming together about another life. Then we will haunt the fen, Bess said, something between an exhortation and a prayer. They would perish and they would wait. History would find them, all the underwater dead, all the family of love, the inmates, and all those who had died in the fens, the centuries long dead too, the ones who died when the Norman invaders came steaming over the moorland from the north, robbers, rebels, lovers. Wait, wait under waters, she said. History will find us. History will avenge us all. It was as good a plan as any.
I wanted to, I was thinking about Topher. You were talking about conversation, and then Bean, you're talking about this idea that who is being excluded, and that I was really struck by how many of the contributions were all very sort of proactively conversations in their like exploration of archive, from Giulietta in her reading was a conversation with her daughter, and Del, there was your conversation with Christy, and obviously Monica, your sort of exploration of archive is grounded in conversation. It was sort of the basis of that, and I think Jackie mentioned it at the beginning, that this idea that archive is always a collaborative process. But it's collaborative with a very specific set of people, and often there is a choice on who that specific set of people is. Who is it for? If there's a decisive act of creating an archive or presenting an archive, there is always a person that or a set of people that you're having that conversation with. And so it was interesting to hear you, Topher, talking about how that there is an audience that you're having a conversation with, and actually sometimes you don't care if no one else is listening because that's who you're speaking to. And I mean, I also thought that throughout all the contributions there was a really strong intergenerational conversation going on. I really felt like there was a want to communicate or make legible so one's memory and one's past to the present, particularly with Del's work, when Del talking to Christy and making all those connections with today and the now, and which really resonated with me, being of a similar generation to Christy rather than to Del. Yeah, I just wondered whether anyone had any thoughts about the decisions that they'd made, either consciously or subconsciously, about how they'd gone about doing that.
Yeah, I think for me, one of the things I enjoy about the idea of archive and Black queer archive is the interaction, is how friendships are archived, relationships. Topher's friendship with Ajamu, how important that is as the creators of the Ruckus Archive and within the Ruckus Archive, and how much queer life and Black queer life is about friendships, is about and then the interaction with the materials themselves, and as we get older, and I really see that in Del's work, the pleasure of that aging process, and the interaction, the dialogue with the aging process. the possibility, I suppose, for me, you know, being Black and queer, Afro-queer, one of the things that I find in common with those two particular experiences, although I don't separate them, they're all one experience for me, but in those, I suppose, those communities, those histories, is around aging, you know, and as a, you know, as a Black person in particular, the idea that getting old is revolutionary, that actually is a form of resistance. To live beyond 70 might even be a thing, you know, in terms of our life expectancy because of the legacies and the present of slavery and colonialism. So that living, you know, healthily into an aging body is yeah, you know, it's incredibly moving. It also is a great reminder of how many of us don't live into our old age. I'm thinking about COVID-19. I'm thinking about so many things, and I'm thinking about Black Lives Matter and murder and all of these things. That yeah, to get old as a Black person is a revolutionary act. Just getting there, and also the ways in which Black lives are so often represented and framed, that we're just forever young, you know, forever young, infantilized, you know, but also somehow that, I remember going to, I might have said this before, but I remember a screening of Stud Life, Campbell X's Stud Life, that, you know, incredibly important Black queer artist. And it was a screening in South Africa, and Campbell wasn't there, I was there. And they were described as a young, Black, queer artist. You know, our old friend of Campbell's, and I'm sure Campbell wouldn't mind me saying that Campbell ain't young. Like, we're not young, you know, like, you know, we're not that young. And it's like, what the hell is that? Surely on the biog in front of you, you can see their date of birth. But just that kind of idea that you're somehow, you know, you're always young, you're always emerging, you're always, you know, and how racist that idea is, that, you know, because somehow there's denial that the possibility of aging is even there, and how that, for me, how that intersects with LGBTIQ representation and the idea of, you know, and that we're in a generation also where we're at a time, if you like, where aging, that this is an age in which queer people are out and older. You know.
I think it's interesting, Oscar, what you're saying about conversation, and also something that you're saying about aging as well, because and just thinking about Monica's work as well in terms of the ACT UP archive. And I was thinking about, when I went to the other side of my studio to just pick up this pamphlet called Sharing Tongues, was a project myself and Ajano did. And there's a whole kind of celebration, remembrance in there. And it's about, part of what we wanted to do with this project was, this was back in 2011, was we wanted to record the voices of the people at that time who were over 35. And so the majority, so we ended up talking to people between 35 and I think 65 at that time. Yeah, Sandy Hughes was 68. And the point of that was because of that, as you're saying, Roger, this focus on young and the new, particularly amongst Black artists and individuals, and the idea that we are new as Black queer people in any culture. And just the visibility alone being something that says, oh, you're new. And even now with the millennial generation, that's happening again. And so I was struck by the ACT UP archive in terms of kind of, you know, thinking about the intergenerational conversations that were happening in that. And you know, and that I did a talk the other day, and I was just trying to was talking about my mother. My mother died in 2009, came to the UK in the 1950s, and talked about Jamaican independence in 1965. And just putting, and then just saying, well, we're talking about 55, and then we're talking about 60 years ago. We're not really talking about ancient history when we talk about the way in which society is evolving and where I sit in that timeline and where younger people sit. I guess so that conversation, to go back to what I was saying, the conversation is with, again, constantly with how things are seen, really, just how things are seen, and to think more differently and in a nuanced way with an archive about the way things are seen, but also with the people that you archive. So there were like 40 voices in this project. So having those conversations, those voices, those people, was just really, really rewarding, you know? It was a struggle. It was difficult to do. And similarly with other people that were, because the archive was, I don't know if anybody knows about the Ruckus Archive, but the Ruckus Archive was created by myself and the drama, but there was no intention. We didn't know how to do an archive. You know, it wasn't an intention. It was an intention to, as Audre Lorde said, write ourselves into history, you know, to kind of make it indisputable as people who came into maturity in the 90s, who were constantly contested about our veracity and our probability. And I'm talking about, you know, literally, you can't be gay. Literally. I mean, people just kind of literally jaws dropping as young people when we were young men, when I was a young man anyway. And so we had for different reasons, similar ideas around, well, we wanted to do something that would say, even if we drop dead, there's something indisputable about our place if someone wanted to dig up and find that. So the Ruckus Archive came out of exhibitions, and those exhibitions came out of conversations. And those conversations then evolved into things we had in our houses and our rooms. And then that became, okay, let's find somewhere, hopefully, that we can look after them. And we ended up, cut a long story short, we ended up with the London Metropolitan Archives as a relationship. But it was always a living archive. It was always about people. It always still is about people and events and community and space. And so, yeah, just to share that really. And I think that's something about the conversation. Yeah, I mean, you know what, it's strange when you talk about work, because it's either part of it's myth making and part of it's truth. So forgive me if I'm telling lies as well as truths, or I'm not lying, creating mythology. But like the film, I lived in New York for 6 or 7 months to make the film, so the drama wasn't involved in that. And then I can't remember whether we shot those photographs before. No, it must have been before, because we shot those photographs in Brixton. I wanted some photographs, and I was training. I was weight training and stuff, and just kind of get myself into shape, thinking I was going to New York. That's it. And as always with things with life, that's why I talk about the messiness, because then we got to New York, and then we were about to film, and then we had no money, and all sorts of things happened, and then blah blah blah. So, but the actual shoot was in Brixton, just around the corner from on Shakespeare Road. There's a bridge just around the corner from where Ajama lives, and it was literally just the thing about me and Ajama when we work together. It's not people. It's interesting because when you read about historical figures, and you know this Harlem Renaissance and rare, everything's quite venerated. You get the sense that everything's quite really, you know, we are doing this amazingly kind of respectful thing. It was like, take some pictures of me, John. I'm going to have my bits out. We'll get around the corner and so let's have a laugh. And it's like, oh, come on, yes. And it was more like that. And we just kind of, oh yeah, all right, there's traffic coming. Okay, hi. I mean, it was literally that kind of laugh. We just sat and then we had cars stopping and see your bits. It was that's what it was like. Yeah. And so it wasn't really this kind of reverential photo shoot. It was just me going, I feel like my body's in the right shape for a shoot. Let's do it, and then shoot them for me, and literally as I walk around the corner. So, but I had an idea, of course, of what that was part of the process of what it was that I wanted to present Fetish as. I didn't really, the film hadn't been made then. We hadn't really, I wasn't in New York. conversations with my DP and my team in New York hadn't happened yet. But in the space of my head, I had a space that wherever he was, he had to be on a street, and he had to be out there, and he had to be juxtaposed with concrete and the urban, the built landscape, and he had to be in monochrome at that time, because I felt that, well, Jarmusch shoots in monochrome anyway, so I felt that I wanted to revere that aesthetic, and I did want him to be, both sexy and inaccessible. In a sense, there were publicity shots, but they were creative, they were artists, they were art, because of Jarmusch's eye is amazing. So there's just nothing that, Jarmusch's eye is amazing. So I trusted his eye, and that was what happened. So, then they just became useful for talking with my team when I got into New York and now. So yeah, and yeah, it was interesting. Yeah. That was that.
We've also been watching. Many of us have been watching your film about a Jarmusch homecoming, and the beginning, those moments where Jarmusch's running up and down the road, pointing at houses and buildings, is amazing. This is where I'm at. This is where this happened, and just that sense of that locality as having this completely different history.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's another thing about that was what I would call our first artistic collaboration. But in retrospect, we didn't know it at that time. We were young, but and again that came out of, as often, kitchen conversation, or walk down the street to look at guys outside Brixton Station or whatever we were doing at the time. Yeah. And it literally was, I'm going to Huddersfield for my first one-man show. And I'm like, oh, sure, cool, when's that? Oh, it's happening in X time. Oh, I might make a film about that. Oh, cool, yeah, all right. And then it's that kind of conversation that creates, that's how Ruckus was created. You say, oh, let's do this thing, let's have a party at the ICA. Yeah, and that's what was fun about it. But then what happened was that the politics of place and seeing place differently became very important. Yeah. And for Jarmusch in the 80s, and me more in the 90s, the whole idea of Brixton being a playground for what still is the largest Black LGBTQ plus population in Europe. Lambeth is, arguably has that, and in the 80s and 90s it had that, and it was not a space which was associated with LGBTQ plus lives. It was a space that's associated with uprisings and dissent and policing, and with what Stuart Hall says in the film is hard-edged masculinity, the idea of Black masculinity, which has, which is a threat to wider white society. And then of course, Jarmusch within his, I don't want to talk about Jarmusch's work too much because he can talk about himself, but within Jarmusch's work, the invisibilizing of his work and him as an artist who was not making work which is about positive imagery.
Yeah.
Do you want her to have an abnormal life? How will she ever get a husband? Be a normal wife. This child will grow up confused. Rewind, selector. Come again. Let me get this straight. You want to take my baby? Guess what them would have looked like if them didn't look like what them do. Make them look like something that them don't, so it's easier for you to know what box to tick on what form. I think you is the one that's confused, Dr. Money. You can change the boxes on that form in your hand, but you not change my baby. Put your scalpel back in your pocket. The Lord makes no mistake. I shall call her Maxie. And if she favor a boy, she can call himself Max the same way. No problem. They call me intersex. And I say too, right, say I'm intersex. I'm a Black Panther. I got a superpower bigger than the king of Wakanda. You can keep your vibranium. I don't need no vibrator. My body is natural and my orgasms are out of this world, star.
Yeah, stars. So the scene that I read for the digital prequel for the summer school is one of the sort of encounters that sparks this old lady who calls herself Mrs. always called Mrs. into space. So, yeah, so there's that one interaction with Maxie, who basically comes out as a person who's intersex, or at least comes out to Mrs. and tells her story, and it's a conversation between the two of them, which is really life-changing for Mrs. For the old lady. And so really that came from a series of conversations, one probably a very long conversation, who's, you know, who's been my teacher in terms of intersex life and trans life, and I mean that, I don't mean that, I'm not just saying that because we're on a Zoom conversation and I'm being reverential. That's the reality, that's the truth, that's my truth. So yeah, those long conversations with Del have been really important, and I'm always kind of, I'm interested in Black life at the edge and the edge of the edge. So, you know, I'm a theatre maker, and I'm not interested in kind of repeating certain kind of images of Black life that get repeated a lot around dysfunctional family, around missing fathers, around drugs. You know, there's a lot of narratives that not only white producers stage, but Black writers reproduce as well, I find. So I'm always wanting to say, okay, whose voice isn't being heard, who's at the edge of Black experience, who is still Black. You know, you're Black and deaf, you're Black and intersex, you're Black and queer, or you're Black and trans, or whatever. So when it came to wanted to make a piece about an elderly woman, an elderly black woman, and her and pleasure, and her seeking of pleasure, and her kind of the cutting off of pleasure, and so that was where it kind of came from, wanting to explore a piece about the kind of cutting off of pleasure and anorgasmia, and inability to orgasm. I was connecting that with the experience of FGM, and thinking, well, there's lots of people in the world who also don't have the possibility of clitoral orgasm anyway, because of a traditional harmful practice. And then thinking, okay, that's one kind of edge of Black experience. It's not only a practice in Africa, of course. FGM happens everywhere in the world, every continent in the world, where there are human beings living. But thinking, okay, but then intersex life, and you know, a lot of people who are, and I won't speak for intersex people, but people who are intersex and talk about non-consensual surgeries, that's also at the edge of Black experience, at the edge of Black life, but is very much part of Black life. And so I wanted to make this piece that encompassed all of those different experiences. But I'm not intersex, and I don't identify as intersex, or at least I don't know that I'm intersex. So that was very much informed by conversations with Del, just kind of learning from Del, and then I raised some funds, and I contacted Valentino Vecchietti, who's an intersex activist, who's also Del's also photographed, I think, or at least worked together maybe on, certainly know each other. Maybe speak to that, Del. And so I paid Valentino to come in as a consultant on the project, and that kind of, you know, important kind of disability rights slogan, nothing about us without us. So Valentino was part of that conversation, and I wrote a scene, and it was very, very humbling. I shared this scene with Valentino, just me and them, at the Bush Theatre, and Valentino said to me, I read the whole play, including that scene, and Valentino said to me, there's going to be a scene in the play with an intersex character, but it's not that scene. Valentino was like, no, and listed everything I had done wrong. And they were so generous, gracious, kind, caring, humorous, supportive. I felt like a white person who fucks up in a meeting around race, you know? I'm just like, oh shit, I've said the wrong thing. I've done the wrong, and it was good. It was really, really good. It was really humbling, and then I reflected back, and it was really about the representation of that character, Maxie. And in the original scene, Maxie had gone through non-consensual surgery, and Valentino's big question of that work was the kind of crudity or the crassness with which I conveyed that character. But maybe Valentino can one day speak about this themselves. But then I remember Dell said to me ages ago, why do you have to represent an intersex character who has been through surgery, non-consensual surgery? Why can't you have an intersex character who hasn't been through surgery and has a very positive image of their body and has a really good sex life? And why do you need to reproduce that? To use Dell's phrase, kind of tragic intersex, or the tragic mulatto kind of figure.
Right.
And so it was remembering that conversation that I just changed the story, just changed their experience around, and that's how that scene came about. And then it really exploded. It just, and then shared that back with Valentino, who was much happier with the scene, and then shared it in terms of stage readings with people who came along, who were audience members, who were intersex audience members, and got their feedback. So those conversations as well, and it's an ongoing dialogue.
Outscription. I don't know if you are worth remembering. I only know there are people worth remembering who are hard to find. I don't know if you are. I only know there are people who are hard to find. Worth remembering. Worth remembering.
It's a beautiful moment. It kind of, it did something to me. I'm a little bit teary.
Yeah, me too.
There's so many people that I've crossed paths with that are worth remembering. And because I have the latent image and the negatives and the positives of them, I get to live with them. Sometimes it feels a little bit like a haunting. And other times it's very, very comforting, because when you looking back in my archive, of course, so many people have died. So many people are gone.
Yeah.
And are worth remembering.
Yeah.